I'm going to ask my good friend and amazing individual and fountain of all knowledge about .NET, really, Richard Campbell, to come on and join me. So welcoming Richard. Hello, how
Good
are you?
morning. Hey, and congratulations on the show. That's just fantastic. I'm so excited to
Thank
be a part
you.
of it.
We're so excited that you are here with us as well. I can't think of someone who can kick us off better, really, with your knowledge for all those new people to .NET, because this is VMware's first .NET conference. There may be a lot of people watching who know nothing about .NET, and you're the person to give us the history, aren't you?
Well, and there's a bunch of different versions of .NET too. I mean, most folks these days know this open source cross-platform product, and that's certainly not where it started. I mean, it's been 20 years.
It has.
We just went past the 20th anniversary of .NET, which was in February, and the 20th anniversary of .NET Rocks is this August.
Really?
Yeah.
Wowzers, that's incredible. But Richard, for those who don't know who you are, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
So I've been a software developer for a really long time. I was fortunate to be born into a family of technologists. My father's an electrical engineer and taught me to solder when I was about 6. So I've always built my own gadgets, and I got into computers by the age of 10. So I've been programming for more than 40 years now, in one form or another, and really not done anything else. My first after-school job was repairing computers. And that sort of evolved over the years into lots of different kinds of work. I've done anything you can imagine, and some startup fun and so forth. I got involved in Microsoft's development tools well before .NET.
Yeah.
And was a VB person back in the day, jumped on board in VB1 in 91, 92. And then when .NET came along, it was the next logical tool for me to use. By then I was a technology writer and speaker, and then I fell in with Carl Franklin, and he's the one who started .NET Rocks. We met in 2004, and he'd already been doing the show for a while. There were 2 co-hosts before me.
I do know that. I think because you've told me this before, that you weren't there from inception, but you've been there for a very long time now.
Well, the previous 2 co-hosts each did 50 shows. So Mark Dunn was like from the very beginning to show 50, and then he got so busy he couldn't do it anymore. And then Rory Blythe came on, and he did 50 to 100. So I came on board for show 100, which was in February of 2005. Having previously been a guest. And I figured, I'll do 50 shows, no problem. This week we recorded episode 1780.
Wow. So you're so close now to that 2000, aren't you?
I can't even. I'm trying to figure out what we're going to do for episode 1800.
Wow.
The 00 shows were always kind of a big deal, right? And, when we got to 100, we were one of the first podcasts anywhere that got to 100 episodes. And to the point where we were crashing podcast players because they weren't built for so many episodes. And so each 00 show, we've always had some kind of celebration. So we're a few weeks away from the next one, and it's challenging. 18 different kinds of parties. It's tricky.
Yeah, I'm trying to think because I've been on. Is it twice now? I'm trying to think.
At least twice. I mean, and actually, at least half the guests on your for your conference have been on .NET.
Yeah.
Although logically, probably all of them should be.
Well, now you have some fuel for your podcast.
Your first show, we talked about Visual Studio templates, was in 2019.
It was. We were at NDC London, weren't we?
Yeah.
And, well, that was in person. And I joined you in your podcast room with Carl there. And I was so nervous. I didn't let it show, though.
well, and those opportunities to record in person are very fun. And it's also helpful for folks who are new. I tend to get first shows in person if I can. Because I think it's a lot easier if you see us. We're kind of goofballs. Once you spend a little time with us in person, you're like, these guys are not very, we're pretty laid back and we really have a lot of fun. But admittedly, it can be intimidating when you've been making a show this long, that folks put a lot of weight on it.
I think it was my first podcast recording as well. So I was like, what do I do at this thing? But it was all good. And I can see Lise Carter in the chat there. She said she sat there at NDC London as well. So You tend to do that at a lot of these conferences,
Mhm.
and you speak at conferences all over the place. And you're an organizer as well. You've got a big week next week, haven't you?
Dev Intersection in Las Vegas at the MGM Grand. So that's our marquee show. I've been doing it since 2012, and you know how much work it is.
Yes.
It's really a challenge, and the pandemic's made it all the more challenging.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we are in person, and we are dealing with those complexities and the challenges of the rules of the state of Nevada, the rules of the city of Las Vegas, as well as just trying to keep everyone safe and healthy and have a great experience.
And I guess that's a really big venue because I think, did I go in 2019? I think I was at Dev Intersection in Vegas. And it's a huge venue, which must help with all of these things going on. But it's just an added layer of complexity when a conference is already so hard to organize, and then you've got all of these additional
as if
rules.
I didn't have enough to do. But yeah, it's there's something special about a week away from your regular work, focused really on your career. You know,
Yeah.
it's that leadership moment. Where am I going? What did I want to do? Where do I want to go? There's only so many opportunities for that, and we call it intersection for a reason. We bring a lot of different folks together to try and help you think about the things that are important for you.
Yeah, and let me just drop a link in the chat for that as well, folks. Oh, I'm seeing more people saying where they are. It's great. I love seeing where you all are. So thank you so much. Keep telling us where you're tuning in from. So, Richard, I've heard you talk about the history of .NET before. I had the pleasure of hosting you at my meetup that I run here.
I think we did a real insider's version of that talk. Like, everybody turn off your recorders. You know, I tend to speak politely when it's going to live on the internet forever, but building a product this long and being friends with many of the people who created it, you know, some nitty-gritty details. And so it's kind of fun when you can sit with a group of folks who really care about it and say, let me tell you how that actually happened.
It was great. I think we were talking for like 2.5 hours or something. It went on for a long time, and it was awesome. You had so many questions. So we're going to have the public version today because it's going to live on the interweb forever. So you mentioned that you started with VB, that's Visual Basic, folks, if you're unaware of that, back in 91. And then that sort of was chugging along for a while, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When did .NET become part of the picture? Why was it conceived? What was its inception? When we had VB already?
Yeah, I mean, Visual Basic was a great tool, and really it came about, and it's awesome to anchor from this perspective too. That the goal of Visual Basic was to make it easier to write code for Windows. Before VB, generally you program Windows in C++, and I did a bunch of that. The problem is when you make mistakes, and you do, it tended to crash Windows. So it was very hard to diagnose your mistakes. C++ is this very powerful tool, and it can shoot your foot off very easily. And so VB was a safe place to build apps that look like Windows apps. Back when Windows apps all kind of looked the same, right? That standard file on the left, help on the right, toolbar approach to building software. VB was awesome at that. But it wasn't a really high scaling piece of software. We did a lot with it. It was possible to build pretty good scale VB apps. They were tricky to deploy. They weren't naturally multi-threaded, and they didn't lend themselves to end-tier development very well. And so Microsoft had been looking for enterprise scale development solutions. And there were a bunch of different forces at work at once. And it's part of the complexity of .NET and why it took so long to mature, is that you had this overarching message of how do we do enterprise development? And then there's also the how do we make it easier to develop for Windows, full stop. There were the runtimes for C++. There was the ATL, MFC. There was the runtime for Visual Basic. FoxPro had its own runtime. And the side effect of having all these different runtimes is that as new features of Windows are developed, for us as developers to be able to program against them, we need to have those features surface through our respective runtimes. And so the different runtime development teams inside of Microsoft are all kind of deciding, how do we surface these features of Windows? And there's a lag. It takes months. And so there was an energy, there was a need inside of Microsoft for a common runtime. Can we build a runtime that it doesn't matter what language you're programming in, the runtime surfaces all those things. So that was a force unto itself, an initiative. Enterprise development, common runtime for Windows. Then there was the web problem. Microsoft was a little late to the web, as you recall, if you go back to the 90s, until Bill Gates had done his famous internet tidal wave, because they'd been all in on like, it's going to be interactive television, right? The public internet was not really a thing. But as the public internet came along and they realized, oh, this is the thing, now they're jumping on the internet full speed. So you've got those three competing forces all feeling around for a solution. Now, Microsoft traditionally doesn't create their own languages. They implement existing languages, typically academic languages, C++, BASIC, those were the tools of the day. But they had, through a Microsoft executive, had made a deal with Sun Microsystems to do an implementation of Java. In a lot of ways, this is lost in time because it was a very brief interval, because it's a different thing to implement a language that's being actively developed by another company that doesn't necessarily have the same priorities as Microsoft. For a few years, Microsoft made J++, which by all accounts was an extraordinarily good version of Java, to the point that many competing companies preferred to use Microsoft Java even over their own implementations. But as Microsoft optimized Java for Windows, which is a logical thing for Microsoft to do, they ran into conflicts with the agreements they made with Sun, and it resulted in a cease and desist order, which basically said you're not allowed to build Java anymore.
That's it. Stop.
No more.
Full
stop. And so Microsoft now had a legal construct that said you have to remove all traces of Java from everything you're doing. Not a small problem when you're a big company like that. So Java was abruptly purged. And my friend and our friend Anders Halsberg, who had been brought to Microsoft from Borland, he'd been recruited by Bill himself, came across to work on Java tooling. That's what he was originally brought to do. But as Java tooling was going to be no more, they kind of needed a new project, and they really needed an object-oriented enterprise-class language. And so he proposed a C-like object-oriented language, or COOL. And that became C#.
I knew all about that. the COOL.
Yeah.
And I sort of knew that there was the cease and desist here. And then that sort of spawned it.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got VB.
Yeah.
Did that just stop? Did something happen with that? We've got a lot of fans in the chat saying how much they love like VB script, ASP with VB. There's a lot of love going on here, and on error resume next, and VBA for the win. There's a lot of love here. So for it all.
And let's be clear, on error resume next, not actually a good idea. But so Visual Basic got its last patch in 99, right? That was SP6 for Visual Basic. And it really gone as far as it could go in a lot of respects. It needed a re-engineering anyway. And there was the runtime problems. And it wasn't web savvy in any way. In fact, our friend Carl Franklin, one of his first books he ever made was doing internet stuff with VB, which was hard. It just was not in the nature of the language. It was a construct over top of Windows, and it was Thunderforms. It was designed to interact with Windows at a very deep level, nothing else. So you have these different forces, this urgency of needing an enterprise class tool because we're moving away from Java, and those things coalesce into .NET. It is an emerged technology, right? It was not an intended technology. But you have this huge group of folks that are very excited about Visual Basic. And in my research in the history of .NET, I've been told that it was Bill Gates' call to stop VB, but to say make a version of VB that runs in .NET. Now, the problem is that many of the language constructs that existed in Visual Basic did not make sense in the .NET context. And so while they had these two languages, they had C# and VB.NET, they were far more similar to each other than they were to Visual Basic. And certainly for the first few years, it was not a trivial thing to migrate a VB application forward into VB.NET. They had made a version of WinForms. So, that was the hub of Visual Basic, it was all about WinForms, and they made a separate library for WinForms for VB.NET. It wasn't the same, but it looked and felt very similar. And so you had this sort of cracked mirror effect of, it looks like VB, not really VB. And it looks like WinForms, but it's a different WinForms. And so it wasn't an easy thing to migrate. In the end, for me, it was easier for me to write C# than to write VB.NET, because I had VB instincts and they weren't right for VB.NET. And so I had no C# instincts. It was easier for me to just write C# because I knew it was a different language.
And just learn from scratch. So I saw Deepak in YouTube talking about how they really enjoyed coding with classic ASP and PHP back in 2003, which actually brings me around to a question I wanted to ask. Where does classic fit in here? Because we've got
classic ASP. Well, I mean, I wrote books on classic ASP back in the day and training materials, because you got to set it in context. Before classic ASP, what did it really do? It brought COM to web development. So all this complicated code that I was writing in the back end that I could do through COM compiles now was easily available to a web page. And that was awesome. Because before that, it was CGI. I was writing Perl. I was writing, C++, like really, ISAPI filters. It was tough to write code that would run well on the web. And classic ASP packaged that up with a few useful constructs, the request and response and things that made stuff easier. Deeply bound to IIS, to their web server, and deeply bound to COM, which had its own problems. COM was, because it was reference counted, as the scale went up, you often got into memory leak problems where the reference count isn't 0, but there's no code that's referencing those objects. And so they're stranded in memory. And that's, the big battle. One of the battles of Visual Basic at the very beginning was, are we going to stay with reference counting and like COM does, which is our strength, or are we going to go with garbage collection, which was a Java thing?
And quite a different thing. Yeah.
A very different thing. And there was actually a bake-off inside of Microsoft.
Okay.
The groups were very serious about the differences, and they, were firm advocates for their aspect. And so they actually did implementations. This is like in 2000. They baked off same problem at scale with a reference counted implementation and with a garbage collected implementation. And the garbage collected implementation did great.
Yeah.
They're led by a guy named Patrick Desailles. And that sort of ended that debate. It was going to be garbage collected.
I'm glad it is, because, I like just letting everything get sorted out for me.
Yeah. Well, and then for the most part, reference counting sorted out for you until it went wrong.
Yeah.
And then, and there was almost no fix at that point. It was reboot the machine.
Yeah. And I can see Steve Collins is saying, flashbacks to DCOM and STA.
Yeah.
So you're giving a lot of people some PTSD here, I feel, Richard. And I think this is only the start.
The D actually stands for dumb.
But it is amazing how many applications are still running in classic ASP. It's still prolific out there.
It's really time to upgrade. There are security problems, right? Like there are weaknesses in classic ASP that haven't been remedied and are an issue. So it's smart to get in there and kind of find a way, build something new.
So that's it. Get upgrading your applications, folks. So we have Sergey on YouTube is saying, you said you were working with classic ASP back in the day. I'm supporting one now. Precisely. Yeah. People are still working on it. So we had this sort of forced hand. Microsoft had to extricate all Java.
Yeah.
And they came to here, and they're moving to VB.NET and C#. And we have Anders working on this language. What happened then? What was .NET 1.0?
Well, so 1.0, there's another force I think that's super important in this equation, and that is that Microsoft was dealing with a row with the Department of Justice, largely over Windows. that resulted in Microsoft being declared a pernicious monopoly in November of 1999. And Bill Gates stepping down as CEO and becoming chief architect, and Steve Ballmer taking over as CEO. And this is the environment that .NET is being developed within. And Steve's first job as CEO was to stop the company from being broken up, because they had been ordered to split into an operating system company and an everything else company. And he succeeded, obviously, but it would take him 2 years. Right? He would get the consent decree resolved with the US government November of 2001. So most of the initial development 1.0 of .NET occurs in that time window. So the first announcement of .NET, the first time that we in the world hear about .NET, is actually in the PDC in Orlando in 2021, in 2000. Actually, let me show you this slide.
All right, let me add it in. You ready?
I had this slide made. Okay, this is actually a copy of the graphic for the Professional Developers Conference in 2000. I had to have it made because the original was 320 by 200. So on a 1080p screen, doesn't look so good.
No, but this looks great. This looks
I had a designer take a copy of it, make a high-res version of it. So we kind of didn't know anything. .NET came out of nowhere at this point. I was at this conference, and I was a VB developer, right? We'd gotten a service pack the year before. Things were fine. And all of a sudden, there's this a new platform based on internet standards. Okay, we get that there's a new, because we're trying to figure out the internet. We've been playing with InterDev. It isn't great. I have front page extensions installed on my servers. That's the world we're living in, trying to do internet stuff. And here at this show, it was Steve Ballmer doing the keynote, not Bill. That was a brand new thing.
Right.
And he talked about this idea of .NET, but he also said, we're going to be publishing the specifications of our new language and the language infrastructure as ECMA specifications. So open. Now, that was not the Microsoft way. That was bizarro land that they would say such a thing.
So was there an open source version of .NET in 2002 then?
This all ties to the same story.
Yeah.
In the context of Steve's job is to keep the company together, he's positioning himself to say, look, Microsoft is going to be more open now. We're going to share source code so people can see what we're doing. Right. You can see that we're not actually making code to make sure your software won't run. That's not what we do. And these ECMA specifications are super important, because ultimately these are the specifications that a young Miguel Diaz will grab and make mono from. Like, without those ECMA specs, that very likely wouldn't have happened. But in 2002, when the product actually finally ships, and you can put that slide away if you like, when the product finally ships, they publish the source of it for academics. It's a project called Rotor. And so is it open source? Not the way we think of open source today. But in 2002, we didn't think of open source the way we think about it today.
No.
Back then, you have SourceForge and very little else. And so Microsoft, who has really no experience in open source at this time, creates a shared source initiative where you can apply for a license to see the source code of .NET. Typically only available to academics. You can't compile it. You certainly can't edit it, but you can read through it if it makes you happy.
Okay. That's
a shared source initiative. And they'll continue with those kinds of things all throughout .NET. When we had the big announcements about the open sourcing of Roslyn, even before open sourcing of .NET, the rewriting of .NET and open source project in 2014, there were folks inside of Microsoft who said, okay, this is the third time now. You think it'll take this time? Because there was always a question of how do you build a community around that? And a lot of that was still emerging ideas of just how do you build a community around source code?
Yeah. Just before sorry, Richard, go ahead. I was just going to say, just before we move on, one of our viewers has shared this picture that they actually took live in the audience at that PDC. So,
oh, that's fantastic.
There you go. How amazing is that?
Internet. Yeah.
So,
and look, that's back when we still thought XML was a good idea.
So that was pretty cool. Thank you, Smab, for sharing that with us as well. So I just thought you'd appreciate that, Richard. So
Very much.
Continue.
So now you get to 2002 and you actually get a shipping version. There was a big delay because there was that great internet tidal wave document that Bill wrote that moved Microsoft towards the internet. In 2001, there is the Security or Trusted Commuting Initiative. And one of the things that postponed .NET for almost a year was they coming up with a great security strategy for it, which we'd eventually called Code Access Security, which while was secure, wasn't all that great. But it did definitely, the rethinking of security to try and make .NET more secure helped. Although you recognize it's an ongoing initiative. Like Microsoft is generally a respected security entity these days, but that began in 2001 with that Trusted Computing Initiative.
And so that's all the way back in 2001, and that's .NET version 1.
February of 2002.
Yeah. So what happened after that? Did we have a lot of people moving across to the new platform?
So you did have folks jumping on board. They did. One of the things that Microsoft had the advantage of is coming after Java. They avoided a few of the mistakes that Java made, especially around type systems that would lead to being able to do generics, which ultimately leads to things like LINQ and a lot of other great expressivity, which is very challenging to do in Java. Because once you have an installed code base, it's hard to revise something as fundamental as a type system. And so the advantage of the second mover was to say, hey, type systems are going to be super important. We have to do this right. Let's think about how we're going to do that. And that's implemented right from day one. So they have that advantage. They also took a long time to ship. And so it'll be only a year or so before 1.1 will come out. That's literally just a cleanup from there. But remember that the goal of .NET was to build an enterprise class development tool.
Right.
And that from that perspective is something I can run on a server for months at a time. And that is not where .NET was in 1 and 1.1.
Well, so was it not there? Was it too unstable?
It was still too brittle. And it was generally looked upon as a client-side development technology. Now, our web development technology at that time was web forms, which, people make fun of today and with some cause. But web forms wasn't built to be an incredibly efficient way to build web pages from an execution perspective. What it was to take a generation of developers that didn't know a lot about web development and make it familiar.
Because it was like a web version of WinForms, wasn't it?
Basically, that play on the term web forms. And that means hiding a lot of state management. And that leads to consequences. Some weight in pages.
Consequences.
But also know that we were also familiar with a component model, that I had a set of controls that I could drop on a surface and build the way I wanted to. And I would argue we've never duplicated the ease of development of WinForms, that ability to drop controls on a page, write some code to connect them together, hook them to some services, you're good to go. We've tried. I mean, WPF has tried. There's lots of other attempts to try and build as nice a design surface as that. Web forms never got as good at that either. It had its own problems. It was a great metaphor, but it's a challenging development experience because the web is not WinForms. But the simple stuff was fine. And for Eternal Apps, it was great. But for without a doubt, it was very easy to build a Titanic page. If you used a grid control, and inside of that grid control, you had other objects that would instantiate, like suddenly you had megabytes of view state. Like it was,
and it would just keep appending it onto the view state, wouldn't it? It would just keep going.
Plus, you had those mixed code models, right? Where I have a little HTML, I have a little VB script or C#, like you're a little JavaScript tangled in there, and so it was very easy to make a write once, read never kind of implementation. Separation of concerns was very challenging, and became a big talking point as software development evolved in that space to say, hey, we need more testable code, we need more composable code. And this is not a model that allows that.
So recognizing that, where did they go from there?
So you've got the programming problems, you've got the reliability problems, and you're looking at working on 2.0. And I would argue and I'm pretty sure I'm right, but I have to composite a lot of information together on this. The most important thing that happened was that SQL Server wanted to run .NET, which seems bizarre. But if you go back to those early days in 2001, 2002, we were getting into the original version of what we called big data. And there were folks that were writing SQL code that was so complex, had to get such large data sets for the time, that they were pressing against the limits of that language. And so they had been basically asking Microsoft, hey, we want a more robust language. We can't afford to have that language outside of the database, or otherwise we have to export. Essentially, you have to query all that data to be able to do your analysis, and that takes too long. I want to be able to do it within the database. We need a more sophisticated language. And so there had been a push from the very beginning to say, hey, we want to you say .NET's going to be portable, because there was going to be a compact version and so forth, which all of that happened. We want a version of .NET inside of SQL. And it took a few years. But in version 2 was the big push to actually make that happen. The .NET team itself was fairly skeptical. But the fellow who led that team at the time, which is Jason Zander, today Executive Vice President Jason Zander, but in 2002, it was PM Jason Zander.
Yeah.
He sent a group of folks to work with the SQL team on making an implementation of .NET that was essentially abstracted from Windows. Like, can we make a runtime that runs in that context? And the feedback they got back was SQL Server was a mature product at that time. The SQL 2000 was a big deal. It was one of the best databases ever made at that time. And one of the reasons it was insanely reliable. They had great testing tools for making sure that every execution path was reliable. They had a break on new execution path. So if you're running SQL in this mode, if it's running code the way it's run before, it'll just run. As soon as it runs in a way it hasn't run before, it would stop. So you can analyze it. And so the result of taking .NET and running it out of the context of Windows and into the context of SQL Server and inside of those great debugging tools is they hunted down these unique bugs that they had not been able to nail down before. Dozens of them.
Ooh. So it's like sifting them out for them.
So the byproduct of 2.0 was the enterpriseification of .NET, that the effort to make it work in SQL. And in the end, wasn't for a certain number of customers, .NET and SQL was important, but it was off by default for a reason. Generally speaking, this was not a good idea. It was a very, very dangerous tool to use. But for Microsoft itself, it helped them make a vastly superior version of .NET. And so coming into 2005 with that 2.0 version, which was the third version, because numbers are hard.
Yes, names are hard, numbers are hard. Yeah,
and a big advancement on web development technology too. This is when we got membership and a bunch of other libraries that allowed us to, and master pages that made us make more robust web development tools. .NET 2, in a lot of ways, I think, manifest the goal of .NET, of a good enterprise development space. You can build web pages, you can build desktops apps, you can expect them to run on servers for months at a time, reliable. Like, they got to their goal.
Yeah.
But that's only 2005. We got another
2005,
17 years to go.
So in 2005, was it still VB.NET, C#, and we're working on web forms? And .NET, was it just web-based technologies? Did it do anything else?
Well, it did the client-side development that it replaced for Visual Basic, and it built good back-end services. Right. This is when the WS Star standards start to emerge of how we're going to interop with all the other platforms, and we're going to speak XML at scale.
XML at scale. I'm sorry, that's a scary thought.
Yes, WS security, WS federation, WS transaction. Like, how do we define in XML all of these interop things, which was extremely difficult. We also have the push even then towards, can we make a more composable web development experience? And so our friend Scott Guthrie, in that time frame, starts to explore what would a better web development practice look like. Now, he's not writing it himself, although he wrote a lot of code. He actually has some very smart people behind the scenes that are experimenting with a model view controller approach to web development.
Yeah.
And there's an apocryphal story. There was another conference that was going on. So another conference, there was another group was an open source group that was forming back then that I referred to on the show as the N-Hibernate Mafia, because the first time I encountered them was in like the 2007, 2008 timeframe when Entity Framework was first being talked about. And they were very angry that Microsoft was going to build their own ORM product called this is Entity Framework. They wanted to work on N-Hibernate, which was already a port of a Java-based called Hibernate ORM that worked on .NET. It had its issues, including way too much XML. But YML, the other one, helped contribute to this instead. Those folks would eventually be known as alt.NET.
I've met some alt.NET people. I wasn't sure if you were going to branch into Mono then as well, because I'm not quite sure where Mono fits into this.
Mono's adjacent to that, but that's the Linux community.
Right.
So Miguel gets his first versions of Mono out in that same time frame. There's a few versions behind, but they're getting there, and it's all open source. But he's in this great schism because the Microsoft people are vaguely suspicious of him. He's a Linux guy. And the Linux people are quite suspicious of him because he's working on Microsoft technology. So
what is this?
Easy to be Miguel. But, don't, irrespective of what's happened with Xamarin and so forth in the future, this is the origins of Unity too. Like one of the largest game platforms that exist anywhere is really Mono development under the hood in the early days. It's evolved from there, but this bringing of C# to other places is something Miguel has facilitated since the beginning, since he read those ECMA specifications in 2000.
Yeah. So,
but that's a very adjacent, separate thing going on from the alt.NET movement. And we were making the show back then, so I was always, familiar with these folks. Interviewed a bunch of them. They had a very logical thing that they wanted, and you can argue how well they communicated it. And I would also point out, and they turned out to be correct, because it's where we are today, which is using open source tools in your development practices. Don't write your own. Don't have the company build everything. Use the stuff that's out in the community. Support it and grow it. And they bought into that very early on. And Guthrie, in his own ways, was listening. He had this MVC initiative going on in the background. Then Microsoft launched Codeplex. And Codeplex was their SourceForge equivalent, they thought. But it was really a place for them to put source code, and it had a forum so you could put feedback into it. And so he got a prototype of MVC together, and then he started recruiting some open source folks. And that was guys like Phil Hack, Rob Connery, Scott Hanselman. On the show, we called them Scott Guthrie's Ninja Army.
I didn't realize that Phil Hack was involved that early on as well. That
early on too. Yeah. And I saw the name Glenn Block fly by as well. Glenn Block too, not necessarily part of that particular, those three recruited in the span of a month, and largely recruited on the back of showing them MVC. Block actually joined the company sooner, but as that group emerged, he joined in as well. And he's a friend of the show, a friend of mine, full stop, just a phenomenal individual. And there's others, John Lamb from Ruby. I don't want to make this pool too small. There's a lot of extraordinary people that were all open source believers at a time when Microsoft really wasn't. But MVC was Microsoft's answer to Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
That became the fun place to do web development. And
it's what I learned on. When did that then come out? So we'd had our web forms. When did they actually say, hey, come along and use MVC? So
we started showing there's an apocryphal story, and it's only partially true, like most apocryphal stories are, that the alt.NET folks created a conference, and their first, it was in Austin, and they invited Bill to go to, or they invited Scott Guthrie to come to keynote the conference. And so the apocryphal story is that he wrote MVC on the plane on the way down. And that's not true. It already existed. He recruited people off of that and so forth. This is in 2007. And
there are a lot of stories about people writing code on planes, because isn't that the story
of
Ray?
He did write the sample app.
Yeah.
And he decided to also show it. because he hadn't really planned it, and he hadn't told anyone. And a bunch of that Ninja Army, Phil and Scott, so forth, they all went with. So all of them show up at alt.net, and he shows off MVC as a model view controller, very testable, like modern approach to web development. It kind of blows people's minds. It's like, we're making better. Oh, and we're publishing it as open source on Coplex. But again, this is not open source as we know it today. This is you have no ability to contribute to the code. What you're able to do is see the code. It's compilable, so you can compile it yourself, and you can provide feedback to it. It's still being developed internally, but there are community editions. There's releases being pushed to Coplex. And that's sort of how MVC got going. This is also where the Ajax toolkit landed. Like a lot of those kinds of early open source tools, they all land on Coplex. This is before GitHub even exists. Yeah. Right? Like this idea of the social construct of code, really GitHub initiates a lot of that. Although the first version of GitHub appears shortly thereafter, but it doesn't become the force. It is till a little later on from there.
Yeah.
But you've got the monopath on one side, and I don't want to discount that because they're doing their own thing. Yeah. And then you've got this more open initiative for certain web things. It's not particularly popular inside of Microsoft, but inside of that web dev community, this is making a difference and creating its own stressors.
And I see that Deepak is popped on VSS and TFS, and I always think of TFS as Team Fortress, which is a video game that's stuck in my head always. Always.
Team Foundation Server.
Exactly, and I always want to call it Team Fortress instead.
Yeah. and VSS is Visual Source Safe. So the only thing they really have in common, they're both source control, and they were both led by Brian Harry.
Yeah.
So Brian Harry was brought to Microsoft in an acquisition of a source code management tool that had a GUI on it that would become Visual Source Safe.
Yeah.
And he actually is recruited in the 90s.
So a long term.
And way back when. But he led the initial CLR project. So after a couple of years of helping with source safe and getting it to a certain point, he kind of needed a new role inside of Microsoft. He actually did the version 1.1 of the CLR were led by Brian Harry. And then he left that team. It was passed over to Jason Zander, and he went off to begin a new source safe solutions. Visual Source Safe was too successful for its own good. It was never built for the scale that it got to.
Right.
And that as is typical of tools that are too successful, they become kind of a joke.
Yes.
Because we press them in ways they were never meant to do. And so he goes on to make a new source control system, which we'll eventually call Team Foundation Server.
Which is, I've only used way back when I only used TFS. I never used VSS.
You're better off.
Yeah. I used another one as well. I can't
Mercurial or, there's a bunch.
There was something else.
We
had to check them in and check them out. I just remember. And I just saw a question. Java Grant is just asking what we mean by CLR, and that's our Common Language Runtime sitting down there. So we've got that. Source safe. Maybe that was it, Christos. Maybe that was it. No, it was SVN. Cobra Ashley, you got it. It was SVN that I used. Yeah. And I hated it because I'd been using Git, and then I moved to another company, and I had to use I had to go to SVN. I was like, what is this madness?
Yeah. You rarely get to pick your own source control, right?
Sadly not.
That's just how it
is. So we've got MVC coming in, and that was, I started with some version of .NET 4 something with MVC. It felt very established then. It felt really...
Yeah, so that's in the 2010 timeframe, by the time you get to .NET 4.
Yeah, that's when I sort of started with it.
And I would argue that 2010 was a foundational version.
Right.
Because between 2 and 4, we have the fallout of Vista. Right, that becomes... There's basically an emergency version of .NET made that we call .NET 3, although it's fundamentally .NET 2, but it takes all the pieces that were pushed out of Vista, Windows Presentation Foundation, Communication Foundation, all those things get picked up in 3.
Right.
3.5 and 3.5.1 are sort of the fixes to all of that, and that's also when we get Link and the emergence of generics, those features that had been on the original timeline. But all of that gets consolidated together in version 4. There's a few really important things in version 4. Version 4 is when Jason Zanders now moved from the CLR team to owning Studio, and he starts straightening out Studio. It's the version of Studio that implements WPF as its user interface. Although still lots of COM under the hood, it does all that implementation. It's also when F# is introduced. F# is added to .NET in 2010. But I would argue even more important, it's also the 64-bit edition. All of that stuff comes into play. The jQuery included in the box. Like, if you talk about the modern version of .NET, this cross-platform open source, that whole mindset, you have to look at these open source moments that come before that. Coplex and MVC being an early piece of that, but Microsoft including an open source library in the box think of how crazy that is. Now, the reasons is pretty simple. They've been iterating on MVC and pushing it onto Coplex and taking interactions from the users and adding it into MVC. And they reach a point where it's like, we need a DOM tree explorer. Like, we need a tool that allow you to find elements and do updates to them and so forth. The thing that jQuery does. And they started on the path of building their own. And the community said, don't do it. Like, use jQuery. John Rezzik's way is the right way. It's what we're using anyway. And they agreed. And then they managed to negotiate with Microsoft Legal to include jQuery in the box, which means if it was in the box in 2010, that means Microsoft was going to provide tech support for jQuery.
That's mind-blowing.
What happened. And in fact, made big contributions, ultimately resulting in the jQuery Foundation, which will eventually become the JavaScript Foundation. All of that starts there.
Wow. That's mind-blowing. We do have a good question from Blake Bender here. Just moving slightly off topic onto something else that I know you wanted to cover. Do you have any insight into the interaction between Miguel and the Silverlight team? Because we haven't even got to Silverlight yet.
Well, and if we're already talking 2010, like, that's almost the end of Silverlight. Like, Silverlight's already happened at this point.
True. Gosh, that was a whirlwind.
So, and Silverlight was this interesting idea. The first version of Silverlight, it was very much about media streaming. So the IIS team recognized that they needed to be able to stream media and multi-resolution media. YouTube's now a thing, and YouTube's magic is the ability to read how efficiently your connection's working and just change resolutions based on what your browser's capable of and what your bandwidth's capable of. So we'll drop down to 480p and then we'll come back up to 720 and so forth. And IIS like, oh, we got to do this, but we need a client.
Yeah.
So the origins of Silverlight are actually based on that. In fact, version 1 of Silverlight has no .NET in it whatsoever. It's scripted in JavaScript, and it's mostly about media streaming. It evolves, right? The next version will start to add in the runtime, and it's a byproduct of .NET 3 and all of those issues that they start to add the scripting, and then they add in the NVVM.
Yep.
And you coalesce into this great version, the first great version of Silverlight, which is 3. But the other important part about Silverlight was not only was it on Codeplex, but it was iterating independent of the main product. Visual Studio only shipped every 18 months to 2 years. And that wasn't fast enough for the modern web development world. And Scott Guthrie saw that. And so he was creating pipelines to iterate each of these tools independently. And they pushed out community versions of Silverlight almost every other month.
Wow.
Well, they went from version 1 to version 3 in like 2 years. It was incredibly fast for Microsoft products, astonishingly fast. But back to Blake's question about Miguel and Silverlight, because Miguel and the Mono team did make a version of Silverlight for Mono called Moonlight. And yes, there was absolutely an interaction between the team. Microsoft helped fund that development. They channeled money to Miguel's team so that they could have Moonlight built as well.
I have heard of Moonlight. I didn't know any of the history about it, but and we've got a question here from Silicon Orchid saying, wasn't Silverlight what Netflix relied on originally?
Well, remember, the original Netflix was a service that shipped you DVDs in red
Yes.
packages. But as Reed Hastings pivoted the company towards internet, yeah, they used Silverlight. And so did the 2010 Olympics.
Amazing.
Right? Like Silverlight was an astonishing technology at its time and arguably hit its height in 2010 at the April launch of Studio, which I helped put on that event. That was when this was the definitive way to build software in the enterprise, right? Like you talk about .NET's original mission, build enterprise software. This was now their primary tool. That it works on the Mac, it works on Windows, it works on Linux if you wanted to. I don't know why you would, but you use Silverlight for all of that.
So what happened to Silverlight?
Well, then the iPad came along. Same year.
Oh, this thing.
Same year. Yeah, the big iPhone comes along and ruins everything.
Ruined it all.
Yeah. So, the iPad's announced in March of 2010. Studio was released in April of 2010. But also in April 2010, Steve Jobs puts out the letter Thoughts on Flash.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the problem with Flash? Well, Flash had been built as an automation tool for web development, right? It was a way to do video and animation and so forth. Originally called ActionScript, and even before that, you had Macromedia's Shockwave. Adobe had consolidated all this into what was now known as Flash. That, and again, we can complain about Flash being lousy code because it was a pig. It ate a lot of memory, it leaked, it had all kinds of problems. It was very tough to program in, but it was also a completely pioneering tool. This was at a time when everyone was feeling around for how do we do web development. And what we learned from Flash is that would be the wrong way. But it also spoke to those different pieces for how we would ultimately get to HTML5.
Yeah.
Right? So, but what Jobs knew is in tests with his iPad, Flash, which was running a lot of the web back then, murdered his battery.
Because it was so
inefficient.
It's
so resource intensive.
Yeah.
But also, plugins are bad, right? If you think about all of our friends that were non-technical people were having their browsers hijacked by plugins all the time. So Thoughts on Flash really talked about, listen, the plugin model is a huge vulnerability. It creates other problems. And so we're banning the plugin model from iOS, full stop. It's going away. And Silverlight depended on a plugin, right? That's what it needed. So at that moment, Silverlight was broken. Like we now have a serious problem. Now, this wasn't the old world, right? Microsoft used to be 90%, 95% of all the desktops. Like all your computing was done through Windows and they had control of it. Now we're living this heterogeneous world where we have iOS and Android, we have tablets, we have all these different form factors and all these different platforms. They don't have control of all of those things. They need to run across them all. And that meant at that time, we needed these various runtimes that ran on these different systems, which means that when the platform decides it's not going to run in your platform, you're in trouble.
So I'm super conscious of time, Richard.
Yes.
Because I know you and I could probably chat for like the next 4 hours on this. I think it would be interesting if we just skip along a little bit and come to the big change. .NET Core and open sourcing. What brought this around?
So coming out of Windows 8, which was the response to the iPad, and this sort of I would argue the darkest days of .NET.
Metro.
Yeah, well, Metros, they can use that term either, but what it really was the last gasp of Windows in the center of the company.
Yeah.
Which one would argue had not actually been the center of the company for many years. As soon as we started getting a diversity of operating systems, the operating system became less important. The same way that your BIOS is less important, the microcode in your CPU is less important. We just expect it to work. Microsoft pivoted towards the cloud, right? That became the focus of their company, and so that meant that making stuff run on Windows wasn't as important as making stuff run on Azure. I don't care where it comes from, as long as it consumes compute, it's the right thing to do. And so there was that meant an open source was becoming table stakes. That this is what everybody expected from code, is that it would be open source. And there had been a group called MS Open Tech, which formed in 2014, or actually 2012. By 2015, it would be over. And they were ostensibly on the outside making sure that important open source libraries ran well on .NET. So making sure Memcached worked well and Redis worked well and so forth. But internally, they were also writing open source code themselves. And they began to migrate existing projects into open source, which is a more complicated process than you could imagine. It means untangling patents and controlling licenses and taking care of all these things to actually open source them. But it was succeeding. And Roslyn, which was this C# written in C compiler written in C#, never intended to be open source or cross-platform, but it was existing. But it was new code; it was freshly written code, so it could be open source. And so they announced that they would open source Roslyn at Build in 2014, which is now Satch and Nadella in charge and so forth. And now they look back and say, well, we need to open source .NET. Like how could we do this? We already have more than a decade of legacy code here. Like untangling all the licensing is impossible. It was actually easier to rewrite it. And also, a lot of .NET code was written for Windows, dependent on Windows. And if you're really going to make it cross-platform and open source, it can't be dependent that way. No. It's also why we lost things like web forms, because web forms was fundamentally built to run on IIS. It didn't work any other way. And there was really no way to unentangle it from that.
And so then we move on to this divergence to parallel code frameworks.
Yes.
Which all came back together last November, sort of.
I mean, the bottom line is 5 is the latest. 5 and 6 are all actually fundamentally .NET Core.
Yes.
They've done a good job of building bridges for 4.8 folks. So if you've waited, it's easier to migrate now than ever before. The same way folks that waited that were in VB eventually got great migration tools to move to .NET. We're now getting great migration tools to move off the original framework into the modern framework. With the note that web forms isn't coming, WCF isn't coming. Like there are substantial pieces that aren't there. And even the WinForms library for the core versions for .NET 5 and 6 is subtly different from original WinForms. Enough that you have to pay attention to it. And there's some good reasons for that.
Yeah.
The original library for WinForms didn't deal with high DPI screens. And you've run into this if you've ever fired up an old WinForms app on high DPI. It's like, wow, bring me my magnifying glass. I have problems.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah. So the new WinForms does deal with high DPI, but it's not pixel perfect. It can't be. It's always interpolating to scale for high DPI. And so you need to have a changeover. So you've got to look at your dialogues. You have to look at everything to be sure it's correct. And they're trying to get us to fall into the pit of success, right? They're doing it the right way. Okay. And that's sort of their approach to that. We're going to make this a little rougher so you don't get surprised.
Which is okay. So we've got a lot of people asking for updates on your book. And a lot of people saying they would love to hear more about this. Now,
you understand how I can do a private 2.5-hour version of the story.
And what I'm also saying, we've sort of skipped through a lot from 2010. You're on .NET in the Wild in a couple of weeks, Richard.
Yes.
Perhaps we could continue then.
I would be happy to.
So, folks, tune into .NET in the Wild on this channel on April 12th, I believe, where Richard is joining me to chat and we can continue this conversation.
And I'm trying to finish the book for the fall. I will do a Kickstarter at some point to get people signed up to get copies of the book. So I know how many I need to print and probably offer some tours. So if you really want your company to hear a 2.5-hour, 3-hour version of this, maybe sign a few books. We'll do all of that. It'll be fun.
I can highly recommend that as well.
It's taking way too long. I'm sorry. It's a very forensic process to go through all of these details and try and assemble this coherent narrative.
Well, there's an awful lot to cover. So no one's going to be cross with you, Richard, that it's taking so long. But what I want to do is say a huge thank you for giving us that very, very condensed version, which we will continue in a couple of weeks.